Good afternoon, everyone. Hello. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for the 19th presentation of the James Foley Medill Medal for Courage in Journalism. I'm here for those of you who are online in the webinar, I'm here in our downtown newsroom with our Q1 graduate journalism students. Thank you all for joining us. Yeah. We're really happy to have you here for this presentation of a very special award. The Foley Medal is one of Medill's highest honors, named for a truly courageous alumnus who we lost much too soon. The award is our way of honoring not only James Foley's legacy of intrepid journalistic endeavor, but it's also an effort to highlight the amazing work that journalists around the world are doing to shine a light on issues that should be of great concern to all of us. It recognizes journalism that exemplifies not just repertorial expertise, but a dedication to storytelling that ferrets out truth and highlights injustice, even in the face of the most difficult conditions and circumstances. We're very pleased to present this year's medal to Ian Urbina and Pierre Qatar for their coverage of the European Union's shadow immigration system, which dispatched migrants to Libyan detention centers before they could reach European shores. It's really compelling work, and I look forward to hearing about its genesis and its execution. But before we hear from our honorees and hear more about the making of this account, allow us to take a moment to show you a brief video that tells you more about the Foley Medal and the alum for whom it's named.
The James Foley Medill Medal for Courage in Journalism awards individuals or teams of journalists working for U.S.-based media outlets who best display moral, ethical, or physical courage in the pursuit of a story or series of stories. Created by Medill's Alumni Board of Advisors, the first medal was awarded in 2003. Journalists working in any medium are eligible. The story subjects may be local, national, or international in scope.
Usually the physical courage that we have encountered and that we wanted to reward had other elements to it, a moral element to it, an ethical element, sometimes even financial in terms not so much of the journalist, but of the organization that had employed him. So I think over the years, I'm very pleased and proud of those journalists that we have selected, who in most cases have been here to receive the award, and I think that that the Medill Medal for Courage in Journalism is now one of the important prizes that the journalistic world looks forward to.
In 2014, the Medill Board of Advisors added the name of Medill alumnus James Foley to the medal. Early in his career, Foley was imprisoned in Libya for 44 days while reporting on conflicts there.
His courage was to go to places where people have not been and can't appreciate. It wasn't to go into conflict areas. It was that conflict areas are, by their very nature, places that most people are not exposed to. And he wasn't going there to be a part of the fighting. He was going there to appreciate what it's like to be caught in the crosshairs in life's terrible decisions that come into play when there's conflict.
Later, after returning to the region to continue his work, he was kidnapped in 2012 while on assignment in Syria for the Global Post. He was murdered in August 2014.
So with Jim Foley, we have physical, ethical, and ethical and a kind of moral courage too, that I hope the men and women who win this award in the future will be able to celebrate by their selection, not Jim's death, as awful as that was, but his life, the work he did, the journalism he did, the standards of bravery, integrity, and truth that Jim Foley represents.
And now we're going to turn the proceedings over to my colleague, Professor Emerita Donna Leff, who is one of the members of the Foley Medal Selection Committee. Donna.
Okay, I hope I unmuted this right. Let's see. Okay. Okay, hi. Hello, everyone. So my first order of business is to introduce Diane Foley, to say a few words. Diane Foley, as you all probably know, is Jim's mother, and she has made it her mission in the years since he was killed to make sure that the world not just didn't forget, that seems too easy, but that the world really confronted and dealt with what happened to Jim and what's still happening to journalists around the world. And I think that was exemplified this spring when she actually had to give a victim statement at the trial, or at the sentencing rather, of one of Jim's killers. And she did that with such poise and such eloquence and such courage. And I'm just very, very proud to introduce her to you now and let her say a few words about this proceeding. Diane.
Thank you, Donna. I'm so sorry. I am very honored. Jim certainly would have been humbled by Medill, Northwestern, thinking of him. I am very honored to have Jim remembered. He was passionate about journalism and aspired to be a man of moral courage. He recognized how important moral courage was in the best of journalism, particularly investigative journalism, because there are so many personal risks often. And I'm delighted today to congratulate Ian and Pierre, who truly exemplify the very best of journalism, uncovering what would otherwise be unknown stories, uncovering stories of injustice that the world needs to know. So I just want to thank you and for all of the wonderful work you're doing. I'm most honored. Thank you.
Okay, so now we come to the program where we I want to introduce the winners, but before that I want to say a couple things about the medal entries. We received wonderful entries that are actually, they're harrowing to read. So if you just sit and read them in a stack, which is basically what we do, even if it's a virtual stack, and many of them are long, it's just astounding to me how much wonderful journalism is still going on despite all the dangers and despite cuts in funding and shoestring operations. The stories just reflect real commitment to excellent journalism. And most of it is overseas, what we get, but we also this year got a few domestic entries, and one of them we honor as an honorable mention. So I want to give a shout out to Lisa Desjardins, who was working for PBS's NewsHour at the time of the January 6th insurrection and continued to broadcast despite everything that was going on around her. And she was, I think, the only reporter on scene who was not locked down. So she was actually wandering around the Capitol and facing the insurrectionists, even as it was going on, and then wound up just reporting live. So that was pretty amazing. And I also want to acknowledge my fellow judges who were Ellen Shearer and Al Fromm. Ellen Shearer is a member of the faculty in DC, and Al Fromm is also DC based, but he's representing the Medill's Board of Advisors. And so we did this as a joint mission, and I want to thank them. Now, I just want to say one really extra thing about Pierre and Ian, because Diane actually said exactly what I was going to say, which is that without people like them, we would not know these stories. But in looking at my notes for today, I sort of see three things, three just little reminders. So the first one is Libyan Coast Guard, and the second one is the European Union. And the third one is African Migrants Elio Conde. And that kind of sums up this story in the sense that you don't really think of the European Union as oppressors. That's just not the first words that would come to your mind. And thanks to Ian and Pierre's story, now we know this piece of a story that they were just running this shadow prison. They still are. I mean, this shadow system and Libyan Coast Guard, like what even is that? And they told us about that. And these stories take so much courage. And I don't know if when they're talking, they'll tell you that they were actually imprisoned by people in Libya, you know, as part of this story. And so I just think it took both astounding courage, but also the production is just a wonderful, readable, accessible story that helps you understand that Mr. Conde was a human face, you know, of a story that really the world needs to hear. So I want to present Ian and Pierre to you with my congratulations and awe.
Well, look, thank you. I'll be very concise. This is a shocking award to receive. I don't think Pierre or I had any idea that we would be in the running for it. You know, these are big shoes to fill or to follow in, I suppose. Jim is a larger than life character in the history of journalism, and especially this sort of journalism. So it was a very touching award to receive for that reason too, in light of the ultimate sacrifice that he paid, quite especially in the same area of the world. It's also a bit disheartening how far things have not moved ahead since his days, and how things are still quite acutely violent and chaotic in Libya. But I was quite happy that we could break the veil of the notion that Libya was a basket case on its own accord, which it is in many ways, but also the role that the European Union is playing in taking advantage of that failed state, and the consequences that the EU leveraging of Libya's chaos and the consequences for sub-Saharan, especially Africans that are trying to commute through Libya to Europe. These were all really important things that I thought we were glad to be able to put forward. But thank you again for the award. Pierre, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah. I mean, it is it's a huge honor. I've been thinking about it, and I feel like it's more something to live up to, like, you know. Yeah. So I feel like, and that feels good for me. I like that idea to like keep doing this type of stuff. And I have to tell you guys that working with Ian I've worked with him twice, and the experiences have been really amazing. And I wouldn't be there if it wasn't for Ian, asking me to come along. So that's I'm happy to have received this recognition, that the story received this recognition, because it's just another reason to talk about the situation with migrants. And I feel like my work in the way this award, I feel this award, was after we got out of prison in Libya. Ian was insistent that we help all of the migrants we spoke to. They came to us risking their lives, now that I know, at least risking their freedom for sure, to talk to us about what was happening. Ian was able to find eyewitness sources that were there when this young man was shot and killed, and they came to us and they trusted us, and when we got out, while we were in detention, we understood that the people that took us were going after them. And it became Ian's mission and my mission to help them however we could get out of Libya, and we did. And I'm really proud of that.
Mm-hmm.
If I could, you can hear me. If I can just interject, can you both just talk a little bit about, I mean, we're hoping that everyone has read the piece, but just in terms of the genesis of the story and how you got the lead on this investigation, and then how did you pull it off? How did you get in there? And eventually they got you, but how did this all come into play? And maybe talk a little bit about the Outlaw Ocean Project too, because I know it's a collaboration.
Yeah, so I'll try to do a fast version of this because it is a bit of a long windup. So I was at the New York Times for 17 years, began a series there called The Outlaw Ocean. The Outlaw Ocean is a look at crimes at sea around the world. And it's especially a look at human rights, labor, and environmental crimes and the intersection of those types of abuses at sea around the world. After 2 years at the Times doing that, I wrote a book, went back out to sea for 2 years, produced the book. And then after that, thought, there's just so much virgin snow here journalistically. I really want to keep at this. So I stepped away from the Times and created a sort of ProPublica style journalism outfit, staff of 10. It's called the Outlaw Ocean Project. Pierre and I worked first together on a piece for The Atlantic. And it was a piece that Pierre really quarterbacked, in that we had heard that thousands, to the tune of 10,000 migrants, were being held on these large rented cruise ships off the coast of Italy. And they were ostensibly being held there in quarantine. These are migrants who had made it across the Mediterranean and either touched shore or almost touched shore, but the Italian government was housing them at sea on these vessels. Ostensibly, they were there for COVID quarantine. In truth, they were there so that the Italian government could sort of figure out what to do with them, and either to send them back or place them or whatever. And also to keep them out of the prying eyes of journalists and advocates and lawyers and the like. Pierre helped wedge our way. No journalist had been on board those vessels. And with help of this musician who was part of this project that we run, an Italian musician, Pierre and Francesco Toscali, got us with the Red Cross onto those vessels. And we heard incredible testimony from those migrants while we were there. That was our first collaboration, Pierre and I, on those vessels. And to a person, they were talking about these horrific things happening in Libya. So it became pretty clear that the next big story we needed to do was in Libya. And that had been a long aspiration of mine. But then it was crystallized in that story. We put the piece in the Atlantic and began a sort of year-long process of trying to get access into Libya to tell the story. It's an outlaw ocean story in the sense that we really focus on the water abuses. And the Libyan Coast Guard is this odd creation. It's a fiction in many ways. It's not truly a Coast Guard in that most Coast Guards face outward. They protect coastlines of their funding nations from external threats. Libyan Coast Guard faces inward, meaning they're paid, they're created, they're equipped by the EU and Italy, quite especially, to face towards the Libyan coastline and to stop migrants that are attempting to cross the Mediterranean and send them back to shore in Libya into this gulag of detention centers. And so this is not a real Coast Guard. It's a proxy force, a mercenary force on behalf of EU powers. And so that was a quintessential outlaw ocean story, that felt very much within our journalistic jurisdiction and focus. And so I reached back out to Pierre. Pierre is a very humble guy, and he won't let you know that he speaks Arabic, he speaks French, he speaks Italian, he speaks English. He's got multiple passports. He's just the guy for this, and he never complains, and he's tireless and an incredible storyteller, visual storyteller. So it was a no-brainer to reach out to him and try to recruit him for this mission. The thought was we would put one guy, another amazing videographer named Ed on a 5-week embed with Doctors Without Borders all on the high seas portion near the Libyan coast, and have him land that part of the story. And then I would take a team which would consist of my editor, Joe Sexton, a documentary filmmaker from the Netherlands named Medill, Pierre Qatar as the team videographer, video journalist, and we would do the on-land part. And our goal was to get in there and figure out how to narratively tell the story of the brutality happening in Libya, but also try to do some bigger things like break the rhetorical sleight of hand that I think the EU was using, where it was discussing this topic as, well, what happens on the water and the Libyan Coast Guard is one thing, and what happens on land is another thing. And we wanted to point out that that's false, that the EU is funding the very guys that are picking up the people on the water and sending them back to land. So when there are murders, extortion, rape, and everything else on land, the EU is quite complicit because they're filling those facilities, and they're providing intelligence from the air with Frontex, and they're providing the boats. So we really wanted to blow up the whole model that was used by European spokespeople to try to silo the discussion in a way that stepped away from blame. But we also just wanted to tell a story, a story of Aliou Condé, a quintessential climate migrant from Guinea-Bissau, who sort of followed this very well-worn path, and sort of the stages of what he experienced ultimately, and his death. We didn't know when we launched to Libya who we were going to focus on. Literally, Joe Sexton and I, 3 days before we got on the plane, said, wait, there was this recent thing that happened in the most notorious detention facility of them all, Al Mabani, and there's a dead guy there, but no one knows his name. Why don't we try to figure out who that guy was, and let's bring him back to life? And that was Aliou Condé. And that was the sort of genesis of the initial reporting effort. Pierre, do you want to add there?
That's great.
No, now you can hear me. If you can talk a little bit too, either Pierre or Ian, about how you infiltrated the centers and you followed, maybe talk a little bit more about sort of tracing this young man's life up until his death. And then for the students here who don't know, the most harrowing part, when you guys were apprehended and they arrested you, maybe talk a little bit about that.
Pierre, why don't you take the first one? Sort of just the process of getting to Gargarash, finding more guys who witnessed it, piecing it all together if you want. And then I'll take the second one if that works for you.
Okay. Yeah. So, on the ground, when I arrived on the ground, Ian had already had made contacts with different aid organizations, and that would visit the I call them prisons. They're detention centers, but they're horrible. We had to go to this. We went to this neighborhood. Moving around in Tripoli in Libya is not easy. We had a security detail, minimal, but you feel like everyone's watching you. I tried to take a walk just one day, just leave, and I was like, hey, where are you going? So it's very kind of controlled, and it's very hard to do anything. But we were able to go to this one neighborhood where apparently no Libyans go because it's so dangerous. Well, we were invited by our friend, one of our sources, to just, have dinner. So we brought some dinner, and we met him at first, and he was really, he wasn't very trusting, but we talked, and we gained his trust, and he trusted that we were legit and we wanted to do a good job with this. And he agreed with our point of view and that kind of stuff. So that's how it kind of started, the process. And he brought a friend in, and then we had other contacts. So it was about reaching out to people and getting places, and it was always very complicated. So there would always be negotiations, and you really have to go after people. I remember people would say, listen, I'm really busy, and it's hard for me to get there, and I don't want to get in trouble, and we'd have to insist, we're doing this story, we're here just for a few days. So there was a lot of work to be done, but that's kind of how it started, the kind of getting into these places, hearing about them, trying to find them on a map, asking a fixer, get going there. That's kind of how we started. Does that sound okay, Ian?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think to add nuts and bolts, the first big breakthrough was figuring out Ali Ukande's name, and that came by way of working sources. And once we had that, then Gargaresh, this sort of migrant haven, slum, ghetto, however you want to call it, sort of encampment city, we needed to get there. And again, Pierre was both playing translator and videographer all the while, and reporter, and connecting the dots between various migrants we met who, hey, we know there was this killing, the guards opened fire on this melee in Malmabani. Have you guys been in Al-Mabani? When were you there? Were you there the night of the shooting? Do you know Alio? Did you witness it? Kind of those are the series of steps where we started building a relationship grid of key folks. We were meanwhile also, again, all much to the Libyan government's dismay, we were going to officialdom, right? So the International Office of Migration, the UN entity, a couple of embassy players. We were working the official angles too, some NGO outfits, Doctors Without Borders, Human Rights Watch, Red Cross. And so we're working it from all different angles to try to start piecing together who can get us into that night when all this went down, and how can we piece together testimonies from all these different eyewitnesses and the like, and migrants and aid workers who showed up on the ambulance, etc. So that's how we pieced it together over the course of that week. We also did some things that, you're investigative journalists, and so you're always pushing the envelope. And we were pushing the envelope vis-a-vis the Libyan government, including we had been, fed the standard line that you get fed in these countries. Yeah, you'll get carte blanche access. You can come in. We're very open about our challenges, et cetera. And then we get there, it's, we got in big trouble. We got reprimanded for going to Gargaresh, as Pierre said, and got scolded, and the police, threatened to kick us out of the country, et cetera. And then we were put on lockdown at the hotel, and we said, look, we're not going to comply with that. We have a job to do here. We're going to continue talking to people. So, tensions were high, but we kept at it. And at one point we had been early on, before we entered the country, and also while we were there, we got repeated reassurances that we were going to be given access to the migrant centers, including Al-Mabani, which no journalist had ever been in. And so we were really, but tomorrow, it'll be tomorrow, the standard thing, tomorrow afternoon. Today's bad. There's something going on. It was clear they were not going to give us access. And so finally we went and discreetly put up a drone over Mabani. That's a risk, but we felt at the time, and I think even more so now, that Mabani was a name, that even Libyans didn't know where it was and how it worked unless you'd been through there. You really didn't know much about Mabani, and certainly couldn't put it on a map. And getting the drone up over there, seeing some of the things we'd heard, from migrants in interviews happening right on camera, that was game changing from the long game perspective, in that we were able to tell this story so much more richly, having been able to see. And then we had this guy, Joe Galvin, who's not on this call, but he's on my team, and an incredible open source investigator, all the while working back. He's in Ireland, and he was piecing together a lot of open source, the lay of the land at Mabani, the blueprints, change over time at the cemetery, how many people were getting buried by looking at satellite imagery, when did they raise the walls at Mabani, all that sort of amazing whiz-bang open source stuff Joe Galvin was doing. So all this was coming together to get an incredibly rich sense of this gulag, and Mabani in particular. The last night we were there, we finished up everything, an incredible reporting trip. We could have left then. We were headed next to Guinea-Bissau, because that's where, we were headed next to Niger, because that's where most of these migrants crossed to get into Libya. That's where Aliou crossed. We were going to do a stint of reporting in that well-worn path. And then after that, we were hoping to get to Guinea-Bissau. We had one more thing we were supposed to do, and it was going to be the easiest thing in an odd way, which was an embed on the Libyan Coast Guard. They had given us not only verbal permission, but that Sunday during the day had given us written permission. So we had the formal letter from the Coast Guard, et cetera. And I had spent the day dealing with the brass on that, and they were going to take us out. So now all we had to do was go back to the hotel that night and sit around and wait for the call when the Libyan Coast Guard was going to go out and scoop up migrants, and we were going to be able to watch it with our own eyes. That's the night when 8 o'clock, Pierre, Maya, Joe, Sexton had gone out to dinner again with their armed convoy. I decided to stay back because I had, some stuff to do. I was a little behind, and knock on the hotel door. 12 armed guys, most of them in uniform. I won't belabor this part of it, but we were taken, and Pierre, Maya, and Sexton were hit in a pretty surgical endeavor that happened simultaneously where they were in the city, in an intersection, and a bunch of vehicles with this militia, which is part of the government, the Libyan intelligence service, took them captive as well. And all of us were then taken to a secret prison, which is at the port, which we've since unveiled, again, thanks to Joe Galvin, and using amazing open source methods. We've actually been able to find the prison where we were kept, and we were kept there for a week while the US government, initially no one knew where we were, but then the US government found out and began to apply pressure, which ultimately resulted in our being rescued.
Thanks for that. And I think too, it warrants, we're focusing on this young man who is sort of the face of the story. When you researched that, and can you talk a little bit about any connections to his family in Africa and what they were told? And I know from reading, he didn't have a whole lot of communication he had no communication with them. And that's one of the things about these detention centers, is that they're not allowed phone calls. They just disappear and nobody knows where they are. So can you talk a little bit about the connection with his family after he was killed?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want this to turn into a love fest, but I do want to shower Pierre with some praise here, because again, it's a pretty unusual thing to have a videographer who's willing to both be videographer, reporter, and translator all at the same time. And that's what Pierre was doing tirelessly then, and then for the 3 months after we got rescued, when we were trying to figure out how to get everyone out of the country. A lot of what we pieced together from, a good 1.5 to 2 dozen migrants who had spent time in Mabani, many of them knew Aliyu and were there overlapping with him, was, like you said, the distinct isolation of these facilities and the grid of them. Not even Doctors Without Borders. And this is one of the most galling things about the rhetoric that you get in these press conferences out of the EU. They talk about them as if they're above board, on a map and governed and abiding. But these are all militia run. There's very minimal access even to federal authorities in Libya, to the central government, because each individual detention center is its own fiefdom, and it's run by its own militia. Typically, some militias have a couple of them, and they're very profitable business-making sort of extortion regimes. But even Doctors Without Borders and the UN has very finicky and very limited access, very orchestrated. They can go here, they can talk to those people only on these days. They cancel on a minute's notice. When they talk to them, there's a guy standing right by. I mean, the level of oversight of these facilities is just unusual. And so that creates the sort of free zone for the horrific, level of rape and extortion and murder that's happening in there, and forced labor. And that was true to Aliyu. What we could piece together from his colleagues, obviously we never interviewed Aliyu, but we got some of his voice memos, and is that they were all held with only, I think there were 2 visits in total when outsiders came into the facility. But usually the first visit was from an embassy person from the other embassy, from Guinea-Conakry, not Guinea-Bissau. And his job was to sort of tally a list of migrants who were willing to go back home. And these folks don't want to go back home. Things are even worse. And so the only way he can possibly get folks out of the facilities is if they agree to be transported home. The irony there is there haven't been flights going back home. So it's sort of, it's a clogged system. And then the other folks who visit were Doctors Without Borders, but again, they were checking on really acute medical conditions and had no power to get these folks out. So it's a very isolated realm, and folks are some folks have been in these facilities for a year and a year and a half, and they are then either dumped out on the street, dumped across the border, or they're sold downstream to other facilities that think they can squeeze them even more aggressively to get them to get their family to pay an extortion fee. So they get released from one, they get taken to another. So it's a pretty, pretty brutal ring of hell.
Thanks. And I think in a minute we'll open to questions, but if you want, just sort of as we sort of summarize the piece and the investigation, you mentioned at the beginning of this talk that it's like you're frustrating that not more has happened. There was a ton of global coverage of this expose. Yes. And for all of you, and if you visit the Outlaw Ocean website, you can see all of the different hits and all of the different outlets that covered this incredible revelation, basically, an atrocity. But where does it go from here? Just as you summarize, and what has happened since?
Well, I mean, one of the things we do differently is we pay for these stories ourselves by fundraising, and that allows us to then own them, and then that allows us to not get locked down in exclusives. And so that means when we run the 10,000 word story in the New Yorker, we have the leverage to say, hey, look, after 2 weeks of exclusivity for you, we're then taking it back and we're going to run it in 10 other languages, and we're going to provide it for free, not just to Le Monde Diplomatique or El País or El Globo or the Chinese paper or what have you, but also quite especially, and in my view, importantly, in Algeria, in Libya, in Morocco,
In Niger.
Guinea-Bissau.
In
Sorry.
Nigeria.
Yeah, exactly, in Nigeria. So I think that's unusual in Western media to have the inroads, to have the budget to translate into, and then to have the relationships with the very places where the crimes are happening. So journalism is less of an extractive industry, if you will. And I think that's really great, like one of our proudest accomplishments, frankly, with this story and others. And it did get a lot of coverage, and that helped also because the clamor was multilateral. It wasn't just a bunch. If you run something in the New York Times, like it's New York Times readers mostly that are going to read it. There's going to be some downstream trickle, but when it runs in all these different venues and languages, you have representatives in those countries then leaning on key decision makers at the UN and elsewhere, and I think the social impact is greater when you do that. And we've had 3 hearings in front of the EU Parliament based on this reporting, where we were asked to testify, some things have. This is a story. Journalism isn't going to fix this, but there has been some the stories and what we reveal, the subsequent coverage, especially in terms of contracts and such, and Frontex's role, has also armed key players like class action lawyers and key human rights lawyers, and then parliamentarians to apply more exacting pressure on key decision makers, especially in Italy, to consider reversing certain stands. Like, it's in the weeds and will bore your audience, but the definition of how far from shore Libya is allowed to claim that it has jurisdiction, that should be 12 miles, 200 at most. It goes almost all the way to Italy. And so that prevents Doctors Without Borders from getting close enough to rescue people. Little things like that are hugely life and death consequential. Frontex putting planes and drones in the air on the EU dole, tax money, and paying for those planes to then provide intel to the Libyans that then pick up these people and commit human rights crimes. Connecting those dots means that some of those big things might change, and that's where I hope things go from here.
And just one final point, just to put a number on it. This is EU money being funneled to this fake Coast Guard and these detention centers. You said it's lucrative to them to house these migrants. How much money are we talking?
It's hard to say. I would say it's safe to estimate in the hundreds of millions over the course of the last 8 years, but that's guesswork, as is often the case with any black market. But yeah, between the extortion revenue, the siphoning off of aid revenue, and the forced labor revenue, those three main streams of income to the militias and the federal government that run the facilities would likely be in the hundreds of millions, not the tens of millions.
Okay, thanks. And now we've got a bunch of students here. So what I'll do, you can't see me, but I'm gonna ask for hands raised. I'll walk over and they'll take the mic and ask their questions. Here you go. John's got one.
First of all, thank you all for your brilliant reporting, and hello, Donna and Diane. I wonder, you talked about the trust factor in these interviews with these people who've been through incredibly harrowing, horrible situations. Can you talk a little bit about how you gained the trust of the migrants to share what they had gone through, and also about these people who are extremely vulnerable, what you did to make sure that these people who probably have not had experience dealing with Western media, what you did to be careful to make sure that in your reporting that you were not in some way re-victimizing them, and that you were protecting them through your reporting.
Do you want to, I can, Pierre, offer up some of the protective maneuvers that I did and always try to do, but do you want to start with the warming up process, how you get folks to talk? Or do you want me to dive in?
Go ahead, Ian. I'll jump in to add something.
Okay, I mean, whether it's the best or not, I don't know. I'll just say what I do. And these are methods or tools that I've tried to pick up along the way over years. One thing I try to do always in these situations is have a really frank, sober conversation with the person sitting across from me about that aims at managing expectations. Because I think what I've found, whether you're dealing with sea slavery or any of these sex trafficking of minors or any of these really sensitive, vulnerable sub-demographics, like they see a Western journalist across from them asking them questions about their story, and their imagination runs with it, thinking that this can alter their life. And so I really try to rein on that right away and say, there's every chance in the world that nothing that we write here will change your life for the better. And in fact, there are clear risks that you're taking in talking to us, and you know them better than we do, most likely, quite especially in this local area. But if you start thinking that just because they're Americans or Westerners here and we're tied to big venues, that it's going to get you a movie contract, or it's going to suddenly get you a ticket, to citizenship in Italy or the US, or any of these things that are, you can completely understand why they might think that. I try to preemptively say, what you're doing here, if you are open to talking with us, is you're helping us understand what's going on here, what happened to you, and the pattern of what happens, so that maybe other folks behind you are less likely to have happen again what happened to you. And so this is a public education act of generosity that you're offering here. And I just want to be really clear. So we have a pretty frank discussion on that. I then have a discussion about and this is hard, whether I get it right, I don't know, but I try to just be transparent about it. My desire is to use your name, your face, you as a full person, you across the table, right? Because the rest of the world who is consuming this are going to be less convinced by the story I produce if I use a fake name and I can't show them. And what I personally think moves the needle on social change on whatever topic is humanizing people. And it's hard to do that when you anonymize them. And so I say to the migrant in plain terms, without journalistic lingo, here's why I'm hoping that you'll let me, actually use you fully on the record and on camera. Now, the risks are real. And here are the ones that I can imagine, and you probably can double that list. And so I go through that as well. So those are, one is a managing expectations and sort of emotional and psychological harm that you can do by allowing them to think things are going to happen that probably aren't. And the other is asking them for permission to really tell their story as is. And then I also often, because we are a slow moving beast at the Outlaw Ocean Project, and we spend a whole year often on one investigation, there is the benefit of time whereby I play that card and say, look, I know for a fact that nothing that I'm doing now will appear in the public realm sooner than X date. So that might also give you more time to proceed on your mission, wherever you're headed. Maybe you're headed to Spain, or maybe you're headed back home, or wherever, but that's my timetable, and I can commit to telling you, you have that one protection of the fact of timing. And then some folks don't, some folks opt not to be on record. And again, it's not ideal journalistically, but it makes total sense. And we then work around those things in the standard ways that, we should, Pierre shoots from behind and doesn't get their face, and we sometimes will mask their voice, or we'll just use text, or we anonymize their name. But in this story, most folks were actually pretty eager to have their story told as them in full form. And then the other thing that we run into, and this is especially, credit to the New Yorker and their fact check standards, which I think are amazing and to be followed. You have to find a way to keep track of these people, because if you lose contact with them and then you go through the fact check process and you can't get them back on the phone, it's really tough to get through the legal and fact check meat grinder that is the New Yorker and some other venues. And so if these folks are trying to be invisible and they're on the move, that gets really labor intensive. And so we have some tactics that we use to try to, we say, for example, hey, look, I know that you're probably in the next week going to disappear from Tripoli. You might be taking a raft across or whatever. Could you give us the name of a couple of other folks, your cousin back home, or give us multiple ways that we can try to keep tabs on you. And so that if this phone gets confiscated, we can reach out to your sister or your cousin or whatever and say, have you heard? And so we try to do those things too. But yeah, Pierre, did I miss anything?
No, that's great. I do think there's something about personality too. How you are with your sources. You're really polite, but you're very direct, and you're humble, and and I think they can tell that it's real. So I always say you have to be yourself, and I can see that. And people trust that. They see a big guy, they see a Western guy that they can tell like there's stuff behind this person, but there's some humbleness and there's some real desire to tell the story, and they see that, and I think people can sniff out what's genuine and what's fake. So
yeah, I think I would throw in something that Pierre's saying, and it's not credit to me. I think it's people are smart. Like whether they're educated formally or not, like the default assumption in my experience is that people are very smart, and especially folks who are surviving in these ways. They're very savvy, they're good readers of people. And so just as Pierre said, you have to be super, super squeaky clean, transparent with them, and lay out your predicament in a really open way to them, because often they will respect you for being straight with them and laying out their options, even some that work against your own self-interest, but laying it out in a way that's like, look, I don't want to. Anyway, so I think that's quite right. Like really winning them over by telling them what you're not going to be able to do for them, and what might not come out of this is helpful.
Thank you both. And I think as we close and we're coming up against time, Ian, you told us a little bit at the beginning before we went live about the the investigation you're working on now. You're in Peru. Do you want to just quickly tell the students what your next story is? And then Pierre, I don't know if you're tag teaming with Ian on this, but what's next for you?
So I'll be fast and then we get Pierre. So this is a long investigation that's probably going to be, 10 parts or something. We've put a year already into it, and we have probably to the end of this year. It's a global look at the Chinese distant water fishing fleet, and quite specifically the squid fleet that brings the world calamari. And we're looking at that subsection of the fleet because it's the biggest portion of the biggest fleet in the world. And it's a thing that everyone knows, calamari, and a lot of people eat. And these are brutal ships, extremely brutal ship. And there's lots of dark stuff happening in different ways in different places. Food security off the coast of West Africa, geopolitical clashes in the South China Sea, human slavery near Uruguay and Peru, murder, and all sorts of different things. So it allows UN sanctions violations in North Korea. And so there are lots of interesting different things that this fleet is engaged with. So I'm in Peru because we're looking at the squid fleet that is presently heading towards the Galapagos or somewhat near there. I'm in Peru, not Ecuador, because we're looking at the shark issues, the shark black market that comes through Peru and Peru gets exported. So I'm in Lima and going to the border to talk with some folks in that trade. And then we'll head out, fly over to the Galapagos. Ed O and I will go and get on a ship on the Galapagos and head out to the high seas where these vessels are and spend 2 weeks trying to get on board and talk with the crew and captains. Pierre?
And I'm not on this trip with Ian, unfortunately. I'd love to be. Whenever Ian wants me on a trip, I will go. I'm right now at NPR working in the visuals department, working on the visual newscast and filming, doing other film projects, including Tiny Desk and other journalistic endeavors.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I want to thank everyone who tuned in virtually and also the many students who are here. And Diane, thank you so much for zooming in transit. And of course, Donna and everyone, Charles, for speaking to us. And Pierre and Ian, really, it's just such an honor to have you join us. And I know you have busy schedules. And Ian, I hope you have a good trip and you have your Dramamine with you, because that sounds pretty horrible. But thank you all so much. And we will see you soon. And your medals are forthcoming. They're at the medal die guy right now. So they will catch up with you wherever you are. So really it's an honor for us, and congratulations again on your win. And I hope that the particular story continues to have legs and make some changes where changes are needed. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.